Thank you, Phyllis, for the introduction. Thanks for all coming, and for LNPS for having me. So this evening, I will be talking to you guys about my current research, and it all has to do with how bees are responding to urban environments. Okay, so if you don't know much about bees, we have about 20,000 described bees worldwide. They comprise 7 families, and we have about 250 bees here in Louisiana. So you're probably most familiar with bumblebees, honeybees, and carpenter bees, which are all in the family Apidae. We also get a lot of leafcutter bees and Megachilidae, and then a lot of our sweat bees and Halictidae. We get a few in the other families with the exception of one, which I think is those are only found in Australia. Does that sound right? Definitely not in the US. So when most of us think about bees, we probably think about honeybees, and the problem with that is they're the exception to the rule. So most bees are solitary, they nest underground, and they don't make honey, they don't have hives. But they do all live for about a year, and so most of that time is in a larval or pupal stage, and so when you see them out, it's only for about 3 to 6 weeks, and during that time, the females are provisioning nest cells, so they're collecting pollen, and the males are out looking to mate. And so one of the questions I get asked most often is which bees are best at pollinating? Is it honeybees? Is it wild bees? And my answer is always going to be that we need a diversity of bees. So just as you're all familiar with diversity in plants, all of the different shapes and sizes, we need that in bees as well. And then I just included this one bee that I took a picture of. That's a sweat bee covered in pollen. And it was just to remind you of why bees are such good pollinators. It's because out of all the pollinators, they're actually actively collecting pollen instead of just visiting for nectar. So I wanted to give you a few examples of why we need a diversity of bees. Let me grab my water. Okay, so this is Hydrolea ovata, and this is a tiny, if you can see it, it's a tiny little dialectus bee. And so just to remind you, the way pollination works is you need this pollen to make it here to this receptive stigma, preferably pollen from a different individual. And so if we look at this tiny bee, the odds of it hitting that little stigma is pretty low. And so you would need a bigger bee in this instance. But these same bees are really good for tiny flowers. So this is Solidago and then Pycnanthemum. And so it's just kind of a reminder that even the tiny bees, they have a role to play. So kind of on the other extreme is a Baptisia flower. So you can't even see the reproductive parts unless you actually would open the flower, which is what this bumblebee is doing here. And so they're large enough to push that keel down, which kind of propels them into the center of the flower, and then they can get nectar and pollen. And so it's really neat to watch. But so for a flower like this, you need a really large bee like a bumblebee. And then another example I wanted to give you was hibiscus. So the hibiscus bee, most bees are generalist bees, which means they'll visit any flowers happily. They do have preferences, but for the most part, all bees are generalist. There are a few exceptions. So the hibiscus bee is one. And so if you look at a hibiscus moschutos, 9 times out of 10, you're going to see a hibiscus bee inside. It's usually going to be a male waiting for a female to come by. And so, and they're always kind of constantly fighting for this space. And I think between all of that, the males coming in and out, you always get pollen that ends up on that stigma. And so probably the first year or so, I was curious if they would visit other native hibiscus flowers. And so I watched Texas Star for a long time, and I never saw them visit. I'd see these bumblebees visit and longhorn bees, but they were always just visiting for nectar right at the base and never going for the pollen. And so probably many of you know, this one isn't pollinated by bees, but by hummingbirds. I had to look that up. I never actually saw a hummingbird, but it's really cute. They'll fly up to it and the pollen will get stuck to their head. So. My last example is Rexia mariana. So something that has poricidal anthers just means that the pollen is held tightly inside of the anther. And so what you need is a bee that can buzz pollinate. And so what they do is they'll hang on to the anther and they can vibrate their wings at just the right frequency that causes the pollen to shoot out of the opening. And so not all bees can do this. This green metallic sweat bee can do it. Bumblebees can do it. Those tiny little lazy oglossum ones can, but honeybees actually can't. And so I just wanted to give you kind of a different way to look at plants if you don't already. My favorite thing now is when I look at a plant is to find the reproductive parts and think about what kind of bee or pollinator it would take to successfully pollinate that flower. So I wanted to tell you how I ended up studying bees because it all began with native plants. This is April 16, 2016. This was the first time I had ever seen Baptisia. That's Malcolm Madream. That's his book I bought that day. I also met Larry that day, and it was the first time I learned about native plants, prairie, all of it. So I went home and I read that book, and by the end of that year, I had left my job in social services. I went back to school to study prairie, and I started working at the nature station. So that's the power of one Master Naturalist workshop can have. And so, oops. Okay, so fast forward a few years. Nope, there we go. I started doing a few bee surveys with one of the graduate students in my lab. If you were here a couple of years ago, you probably heard him speak, Andrew Buderi. So I did a few surveys with him, and we would look at all the way from coastal prairie, so that's Gum Cove here at the top, and then all the way up to the flatwoods in Kisatchie. And I was fascinated by the diversity of bees that we saw. And so I would go home and wonder which of those bees would show up in my own yard. And so this was during COVID. I had a lot of free time. I put in my first garden. So this was the first year, and I had collected most of that seed from our research site. So it wasn't hard for me to get that gold level certified habitat. And once again, I was really shocked at the diversity of bees. So I got the specialist hibiscus bee. I got a lot of leaf cutter bees. I even got the brown belted bumblebee and the longhorn bees. These are males sleeping outside at night, and even some cuckoo bees. So that kind of drove my research. Once I did enter the program, I wanted to know which bees are showing up here and why, and the ones that are showing up here, are they responding to these changes in the environment? And so the first thing I thought about was how are urban areas different from the rural sites or wild sites, and there's a lot of ways, but one that was not really looked at yet a lot in the literature was that urban areas are warmer just due to the increased amount of impervious surface cover, and so that's called the urban heat island effect. And so what I did then was I planted these 12 gardens on an urban-rural gradient, and that's what my gardens looked like. They were 3 meters by 3 meters. They had about, I think, 16 different plant species, 80 total plants, and I'll show you the list soon because I'm sure you're curious which plants. But I originally made the gradient in ArcGIS, so I would look at different radii, and so this is just an example of an urban garden, a suburban, and a rural. And so the tan is impervious surface cover, and the green is green spaces. Colby actually made these AI-generated bees for me, so I have a city bee, a suburban bee, which is cutting the grass, if you can't see it down there, and a country bee. And so I set out these loggers, which is what LMPS, the grant, helped me purchase, and I was really excited to see that even in a small place like Lafayette, there was a temperature difference going on, especially between the urban site and the rural ones. So here's my plant list if you were curious. I chose these because I wanted plants that would bloom from early spring into late fall. And then I wanted to attract the specialist bee on hibiscus, and I was trying to attract another specialist bee on rudbeckia, but I don't think I got it. But I wanted to cover as many families as possible, and this was kind of also what seed I had collected and what did well in the greenhouse. So those are the ones I planted and the number of plants that I put in for each one. And so my first hypothesis was that as temperatures rise in urban areas, bees would have a higher heat tolerance. And so every living thing has this a CT max and a CT min, so it's just critical thermal maxima and minima. And so since we're in a really warm place, I wasn't worried about the CT min, but I did want to calculate CT max. And so the way I did this, I included a photo just to show you how sophisticated my setup was. I would hold the vials down with candles and hole punchers. But this is a water bath, and so I collected 4 target species from across the gradient, and I would put them in the water bath, and I'd raise the temperature 0.5 degree Celsius every minute, and then I would pull them out and just knock them over. And so they would right themselves, and basically at the temperature that they would stop righting themselves because they would lose muscular control is their CT max. So then you take them out and you record that number.
What does CT stand for?
CT is critical thermal, yeah. So then these were my results, and I'll kind of walk you through them. So if we start down here with the longhorn bee, we can see that as we increase an impervious surface cover, so as we get into these urban areas, we did have that positive effect. So their CT max did increase. We see that same trend with the specialist bee, the hibiscus bee. It's just not as strong. And then with the sweat bees, we didn't see any trend, and with the little tiny lazy ogossums, we saw this really idiosyncratic trend. And so what I want to point out though is that these top 2, we actually haven't keyed down to species yet. It's really hard to do it. I think there's only a few people in the US that can work on lazy ogossum. So I'm hoping that once we're able to key those out, that these will make more sense. Additionally, I wanted to see also the further we got into summer, so that's day of year, if we saw that same trend. So did they also have a higher heat tolerance the warmer it got? And we see that same thing happening, especially with Melisodes, the longhorn bee. Tylothrics, same thing. It was, it's there, but it's not as strong. And then we see kind of these other things that I think might make sense once we are able to key those out. And then, so for the longhorn bee, that's the only one I had enough males and females to look at. And I will say the reason why I thought there might be a difference between males and females is because females are often in their nest underground or in a cavity, so they're not as exposed to temperatures as males are. Males never enter the nest, and so they're always outside. They sleep outside, so they're more exposed to the temperature. And so Not too surprising, I did see a difference. So these are males on the right side, and you can see that both impervious surface cover and day of year, they have that positive trend, so they are increasing in their CT max. Whereas the females, you don't see anything with day of year, but with impervious surface cover, you do see a little increase, but once you hit about, I don't know, maybe 30% impervious surface cover, it just kind of plateaus. And so I'm really hoping that this summer, I'll be able to get more leaf cutters and other bees and maybe be able to look at this again with those. And so my second hypothesis was that their body size would also decrease in urban areas. So since bees are ectothermic animals, their biology is closely tied to thermal temperatures. And so as the bee's body size gets smaller, its surface to volume ratio increases. So that would facilitate cooling. And so the way that I did this is you just put the bees under a microscope here, and I have a little scale bar. So this is what it looks like once you're under the microscope. And you measure something called the intertegular distance, which is just this distance between the tegula. The tegula are just where the wings are attached. And so I just did this last week. And so this is pretty new data for me, but I still wanted to share it with you. So if we're looking at the longhorn bee, we do see that the body size is a little bit larger in rural areas compared to urban ones. The only data that's significant here is actually between suburban here in the middle and rural. But if we look at Tylothrix, the hibiscus bee specialist, we can see that it's a little bit more significant. So we have significant difference between suburban and rural and also urban and rural. And so I think that even if we looked at maybe just males too, that pattern would even be a little bit more significant. So that's just very preliminary data for that. And then this is something else I haven't had time yet to look at, but community shifts. So everything I've talked about so far has been within species variation, but I'm also interested in among species variation. So I think that same sort of thing could be happening, right? So bees in urban areas may be smaller bodied and may also just in general have lower CT max. And I wanted to just give you one example. This is something we already know in the literature, but for bumblebees, and this was very obvious to me, just from one summer, I saw almost 45 in rural areas, and then in suburban and urban, I saw less than five or less. And so I think I mention this because my third hypothesis kind of has to do with this. Which is that pollination services would decline in urban areas. And so if you're having smaller bodied bees in urban areas, you may be having a decline in pollination. And so the way that I check for this, my example here will be Silphium, but I did do it on a lot of different plants on the site. I just tagged 2 flowers, and so one will be open pollinated. The other one I'll put an exclusion bag on so nothing can visit it. If any pollen does get on it, it's just going to be its own pollen, so it'd be selfing. And then I just wanted to include this because this is hibiscus, and it's very obvious to me, to everyone, that the one that isn't visited by bees is tiny. You don't even need to take it to a lab. You can see the difference here. But with Silphium, in my lab, I'll just open each one, and you can kind of see, if you can see an embryo, then it was successfully pollinated. If not, it wasn't. So I counted all those seeds, and this is once again something I just finished doing maybe 2 weeks ago. And so for Silphium, at least, there is a very significant difference between the percent of developed seeds between urban areas and rural and suburban. So I'm interested to see if that trend continues with all the other plants, and I suspect that it will. And so that's currently where I'm at. I still have a lot of seeds to count, a lot of bees to measure. But I did take a lot of data last summer, and so I thought, well, this is a plant conference, so maybe you're more interested in plants. And so here's my list of plants again, and I was curious which plant you think had the most bee visits, if you have any thoughts. Oh, I should say, you probably noticed earlier that not everything is planted in even numbers. So like this is just for fun data. If Larry was here, he would definitely argue with me about the next slide, it was Silphium. Yeah, by far. Larry would argue with me because Eryngium yuccifolium rattlesnake master, he always says, is like the bee plant. And I will say that I only had one of these on each site because it was a last minute decision. So that would probably be higher. So these plants are still great, but just for example, Silphium had the most, and then it was Monarda, Fistulosa, Hibiscus moschutos, Helianthus, Pygnanthemum, Giardia, Echinacea, Rudbeckia, Texana. So then I thought, well, that's interesting, but like something like hibiscus, I know that only really the hibiscus bee is going to it. So I thought, which plant do you think had the most unique species of bee visits, which may be more interesting than just number?
Unique bee species.
Unique bee species, right.
Pygnanthemum.
It's Silphium again. It's Silphium again by far. Over 20 different species. And then it was Helianthus, Pygnanthemum. And I will say Pygnanthemum is fantastic for wasp. I didn't count wasp. If I did, I'm sure it would win because it's got all the great solitary wasp on it too. But so Pygnanthemum, Giardia, Monarda, Rudbeckia texana, partridge pea, Echinacea, Rudbeckia grandiflora. One thing I didn't think about, because I'm not as much of a plant person, I guess, as a bee person, but when I was doing my research design, I thought that I would plant the same garden along this gradient and they would all behave the exact same way, which is not true at all. As you can see, plants do not really they don't put out nearly as many blooms their first year in urban environments. You guys may know more about why, but I definitely wanted to share that with you. And so what I did, this is total number of blooms, but then I did it by plant. So then I figured, which plant do you think was the most resilient, meaning it put out the same amount of blooms across all of the sites? Yeah, obviously, it's Silphium. Which is really surprising because one of my sites got sprayed twice with herbicide because it was too close to a railroad, and it still put out almost the same amount of plants as it did in like people's yards. And so yeah, and just to show you that I'm not just showing you that one, this is a few other ones. So this is Echinacea purpurea, this is Rudbeckia texana, really hates urban areas, hibiscus even more so, and then Monarda. So they all just across the board did much poorer. And I'm curious, this will be year 2, so maybe it'll be a little bit different, but I just thought that was interesting. So yeah, my conclusions. So there is evidence for this plastic response in CT Max, which is a great thing, right? We want to see that they can, I don't know if adjust is the right word, but have some kind of response to these changing environments. There's evidence for also a shift in body size, and that pollination success does decline in urban areas, but not in suburban. So if you have a garden, it's really important to have gardens in everywhere. But if you have a garden in a suburban area, it's doing really great things, not only for the bees, but also for the plants. And then just that Silphium is the best plant ever. which we went to the Prairie conference in Iowa, and I fell in love with, we don't have that one here, but the cup silphium. So yeah, silphium's just my favorite. So I'm pretty sure I have time for questions, if anyone has them. Okay. Yes. Yeah.
Two questions. Did you see any difference in timing of limbs between your three types?
Yes. And I have all of that down, and it's definitely something I want to look at. Yes.
And was there a difference in like bee emergence time too?
That I can't say because of the way that I can't say because of the way that I surveyed. Just the schedule I was on, there was no way for me to keep in mind like what was happening. But it does live in my data. It's just a matter, I just finished classes, and so this is the first time in January I've been able to even look at my data. And so yes, that is definitely something I wanted to look into, was also behavioral changes, because that could, maybe not sync up when plants are receptive and they're putting out pollen.
Do you think, since it was so brutally hot last year, if we get a close normal summer, you'll see more of a difference in bee responses to drought stuff?
I don't know. It's almost like it worked out really well that it was crazy hot, because I really did get that difference. I feel like if it wasn't, then maybe the sites would be a little bit more similar, and so maybe I wouldn't see as much. And so it'll be nice to have a couple of years of data to compare, especially if for some reason the summer is super mild, which I doubt it will be, but you never know. Yeah, I know. Yes.
Okay, so if the bees in the urban areas are smaller of a given species,
Right.
okay, is that a selection event, or is that individuals are not developing as large, or what do you think is happening?
I don't-
Speculation.
I don't think it would be selection. I think it would probably be, I don't know enough about bee development, so maybe like when they're actually developing that, and I know there's probably papers out there on that's looking at that, they're probably raising them under different temperatures and seeing how that affects it. So I think it's probably, I don't know. I don't know enough about that. It's a good question though. Yes.
I have the second question, but phrase differently. Is the CT min, CT max an endogenous trait that's less plastic, or is it something that changes the environment? That's another one.
I don't know. Yeah. I don't know if anyone knows for bees. There's something I was actually thinking about last night when I couldn't sleep, was I should have looked at how many other like insects they've looked at like plasticity in. I know that plasticity is something that can be not selected for, but that it can evolve, but not that actual.
It's like strength.
Yeah.
If someone gets strong in prison, for example,
Yeah.
it's surprising. But if it's an endogenous characteristic, then it sounds selective. Yeah, it sounds that would be awesome.
Or it could be endogenous, the ability to, that's what I'm talking
Yeah.
about, phenotypic plasticity, where it can change.
Yeah.
The innate ability to change.
Yeah, it would be great for another graduate student to look into. Yeah, Lawrence.
So I know you aren't done analyzing your data now, but at least so far, has anything really struck you as surprising, just jumped out at you? This is, something you didn't expect.
I didn't expect to actually see anything that I was looking for. I don't know, I didn't, because Lafayette's so small, and so even someone on my committee was like, yes, this is great, but also you need to do this in Houston and all these other, much bigger cities. And so I think both me and my advisor were surprised when there was significant data. Yeah, I think it surprised me a lot how different the plots were, based on where they were located. I didn't realize that. Sorry?
Where were they located?
So I have four, or if you're familiar with Lafayette, I have four close to downtown, as close as I could possibly get. And then I have a slide, but it might take a while to get to. Kind of in the neighborhood surrounding them, I made sure that they were all, I think, about 2 miles apart, just to make sure that the bee communities they weren't the same. So I wasn't surveying the same bees at different sites. There we go. So I don't know if this helps, but that's downtown Lafayette. And then I have 4 here, and then these were my 4 rural sites. And so I don't know if I have the numbers memorized, but rural sites were, I think, around 7% or less impervious surface cover.